Hi, in this video I'm going to show you how to prepare the hem of your lining for sewing, as well as finishing off the lining of your sleeve. So I've already done one on this sleeve here, and so we're going to do this sleeve next. Before we can do those sleeves, we need to tack our lining in a few places in order to make sure that it's secure and is giving the proper amount of ease that we need to be able to move comfortably in our jacket. So often the lining is the same size or a little bit bigger than your garment, and then it's made out of a thinner, lighter fabric so that it moves around. So to start, I need to tack it in a few places. So I've also tacked it, at my shoulder seam, my underarm seam. I've also tacked it inside on my facing seam allowance here. So this cross stitching here is the front facing and lining seam allowance sewn to my canvas. Now on my other side, I do not have canvas, so I'm going to pin this in place. I'll pin that lining and facing to the front of the jacket. And that allows me to open it up and access this. Now, like I mentioned, I don't have any canvas to sew to, so instead I'm going to be sewing my seam allowance or my dart to the jacket dart, just like I did with my bound buttonhole. So right here, I'm just going to be doing a cross stitch those two together. So with my waxed thread, make a knot, and then because I'm able to lift this up because I pinned it, just want to make sure that your stitches don't show through to the right side. So you're not going deep into that dart, you're just going kind of shallow. And I'm just sewing right over the edge of this seam and then into the dart and then into my seam. And then here where I can't quite get over the edge, I'm just going to go through all the layers, just making sure I don't catch all the way through. So in general, you want to tack your lining in a few places on the inside so that it's not just falling out and loose. And do make sure you're getting all the way through your seam allowance into that dart if you have to go through all through the layers. Another area that you can attach your lining to would be to a pocket, if you had one on your jacket. So do try to keep your tail halfway so you don't get it caught like this. So if this tail is halfway between the needle and the garment, it won't get caught and it won't come unthreaded. Okay. So that's one area that it gets tacked, and then you just make a knot with a few stitches in the same place. And then hide your tail. All right. So that's one area that's now secure. So if I flip this back to the right side and take these pins out, this can no longer pull apart where the facing is attached. And you looks seamless. It doesn't show on this side. Okay. The other area we're going to tack is in the shoulder. So I'm just gonna knot my thread here. Okay. So on a full-size garment, often these tacks would be on the inside of the garment, but as this is such a small garment, it is perfectly acceptable for them to be on the outside of the lining, just not showing through the fashion fabric. So what I've done is I've located my shoulder seam on the lining side and just making sure that that seam is directly above there. I'm just going to go into my lining and into the shoulder pad multiple times, tacking this shoulder in place. And then knotting it off. Now, again, you would do the same thing in the armpit area. So this garment doesn't have an armpit seam allowance, but it does have a low spot on the underarm seam. So I'm going to go into that and then, or I'm going to show you how it would be done on such a small garment. So as you can see here, right in the seam allowance, I've folded this up and over the seam allowance and we just stitch right in there. So it just pinches up a little bit of that lining fabric into the sleeve, giving you just a little bit more ease of movement and length for that sleeve area. So I'm going to do the same thing on this side. So I'm going to locate the opposite end of my shoulder dart, so from here to here, and then I'm going to reach inside and just make sure that my seam allowances of my underarm seam, so I don't know if you can see that, but there's a seam allowance here and a seam allowance here of my lining. I just want those on top of each other. And then from the lining's right side, I'm just going to smooth that. So it's just, I just have a piece of fabric going up and over that seam. And I'm just going to pin it in place and take this to the machine to sew it. And I'm just going to sew just right at the bottom in that seam allowance, making sure I don't sew through to the other side. So I'm just placing it in the machine, just making sure I have as few wrinkles as possible in the lining, but as it's the lining, it's acceptable. I'm going to sew just kind of just outside of that stitching line, just so I don't accidentally go through to the other side. I'm just going to go about, I don't know, 5-7 stitches across and then back again. So and then clip those threads. And then just double check that it didn't show through on the right side. And we're good. Okay, so that's about the minimum amount of tacks you would do on a garment. Sometimes it's also tacked down the center back seam to center back seam, or side seams to side seams. But we're going to stop there because I think you get the idea. Okay, so now we're going to work on preparing the sleeves. So the first thing you want to do is pull the sleeve seam allowance gently in that arm, or pull it down and out so that you can see that you have extra lining. Usually you have 1 to 2 inches on this size, but you should have at least an inch or 2 as well on a full-size garment. And what you're checking is just making sure that these seams are lined up. So my underarm seam lines up with my underarm seam, and then I'm going to just gently pull those apart, and I'm going to pin it again about 5 inches up, and then flip it over and find my other seam, sleeve seam, and then just make sure that those are lined up as well. So, And when you're pinning this, you want to make sure that there's no wrinkles, that the lining is not pulling on the sleeve and creating puckers. So it should be nice and straight. So if you have any puckers from it, then you want to push a little bit more lining inside. Okay. So once you have that pinned, you're going to baste it around so that we can turn it right side out without stabbing ourselves. Okay, so about the same 5 inches up, I'm just going to baste all the way around the lining to the sleeve. And then you can take those pins out. Okay, so once you have that basted all the way around, then you can turn it inside out. Okay, so once you get that turned, it's okay if this has a little bit of extra there. That's actually good that we have a little bit extra in our sleeve. So, okay, so then the next thing you're going to do is turn up or make sure that your hem is only about an inch or so long or longer than your sleeve. You don't want it too long because it does get in the way. And then you're going to turn this in so that it's about 1/4 inch on this scale, shorter than your jacket. So I'm going to just put a pin here, marking that, and then I'm going to turn that up so that it's about 1/4 inch shorter here. And I'm not worrying about the vent just yet. I'll deal with that in a minute. And then you're going to flip this up. Again, about 1/4 inch shorter. Okay, so I'm just pinning the lining at this time, not the lining to the jacket, because we need to actually slide the lining up so that it is further away from the hem when we actually go to sew it. So this lining is able to be moved, but it is pinned so that when it's smooth and flat, it's about 1/4 inch away. Okay. And then same thing here. I want this about 1/4 inch away. Here. And about 1/4 inch away here. Okay. So when I get that, the length I'm looking for, I'm actually going to move it up and pin it so that it's about, on this scale, 5/8 of an inch away. So right about there. And this seam should be lined up. So again, about 5/8 of an inch away. So on a full-size garment, I would make this 1/2 inch and maybe 3/4 of an inch away. So the distance here is there. And what that's going to do is create a little ridge or a little bubble of fabric all the way around, and that's what you want. You want this to be a little bit extra here, because then when we finish sewing it, that will come down. All right, so when you're looking at your sleeve vent, the part on the vent that's on top is actually your under vent. And this is the side we're going to start with first. So the lining that is on the side that has the vent on top, which is actually your under vent, we're going to take this piece and we're going to refold the edge here. So this is the edge next to the vent in just enough so that when it is next to or in place, it will be just on the edge of this piece here. Okay, so it's about 1/4 inch on this, maybe a little bit more, but just depends on how much seam allowance you have on your pattern. And so it should just barely cover that vent. Okay, and again, we have a little ridge of fabric here. So I'm going to just pin this in place here. Again, about 3/8 of an inch, or sorry, 5/8 of an inch up from this jacket hem edge. Okay, and now I'm going to go to the other side, and I need to clip the seam allowance of this, because what we're going to do is we're going to turn the upper vent side in, and bring it down next to the vent opening here. But because our seam is way over here, we need to put a clip in diagonally so that we can then fold this in and here and then go straight down. So diagonally here and then straight down. I'm just going to take this pin out temporarily and find that seam allowance. So here, this little bit of stitching right here, so behind right there. So right there is the end of my seam. So I'm going to go about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch below that. And then I'm just going to cut it diagonally. And I only need to cut it a little bit, just enough so that when I go to put this in place, I can turn this edge in diagonally so that this seam can come over. So I'm just going to pin it first. And then flip this piece in. If I haven't got enough, then I can always cut a little bit more, but I start a little bit cautious, 1/4 inch, 3/8 of an inch, and then I can go more if I need to turn this over, because the goal here is to have this go right down the edge of this lap. So this is my seam allowance from the vent. So I want to go right next to that. So I'm going to just cut a little bit more, maybe another 1/4 inch, and then that should allow me to clear when I fold it, to just clear. I don't want to go too far because I don't want to see these stitches. So I don't want to go so far that that becomes exposed. So I've now got my angle cut so that I can bring the diagonal over and pin it in place temporarily. And then I'm going to tuck in this edge and then fold it in again. So, so the goal here is that this bit of lining, so it normally, remember I said it was about 1/4 inch away, I'm going to pull it up to that 5/8 mark and pin it in place, kind of tucking that seam allowance in. This doesn't have to be perfect yet because we're not sewing it along this edge just yet. But, okay, so so I've created a little opening so you can see the vent here, which is how it's done. I don't find it the prettiest, but it is okay. And so the goal here is to try to hide that stitching. So I maybe should have gone a little bit lower with my clip, more angled, but I will fix that when I get to it. Okay, so now, so I have a little bit of a tuck here, so I'm actually didn't fold that enough, so I need to redistribute this so that I can get rid of more of this. So I'm going to fold this over, or fold this in more. Fingers will allow me. There we go. So the goal is here when I fold this in that it's nice and smooth there and is right at the edge. Okay, again, with a tuck up here, right at the moment. Okay, so you're going to baste this in place just because I don't like being stabbed. So this is just long enough, basted just long enough for you to sew the bottom with a whip stitch or a slip stitch. Okay, so then I can take out some of these pins so that I'm less likely to stab myself while I'm sewing this. I'm going to leave these two in for now. Okay, so I'm going to whip stitch this all the way around the bottom. So we're not sewing the vent yet. So I'm just going to hide my knot by coming in through the fold. And then you're just trying to keep this at that 5/8 of an inch away. I think sometimes they call this a fell stitch if you're not actually seeing the diagonals, and you want to make sure it does not go through the right side of the sleeve. Ideally about every 1/4 inch apart. I do get a little lazy with this because this isn't a seam that undergoes a lot of stress because of that extra. So even up to like 3/8 of an inch is fine. So, and if you want to mark it so that you have some consistency, if you're not used to hand sewing. So I'm just trying to make sure I'm only catching the hem of my sleeve, not my front side. Okay. When you get to this other side, I'm just going to have you knot it if you're, when you, if you get to this side and you're on the, so this is the overlap side and it has that diagonal. If you're on this side when you get to the end, you're going to knot it off because we need to adjust the folds. If you're on the other side, you can actually sew up this edge. So if I had my other sleeve, but you don't just go sew it right away, you're going to again adjust the folds, but then you don't have to cut the thread, like knot it and cut the threads off. On this one I'm going to knot it and cut the threads off because I need to sew this side first. So what I'm going to do is take that pin out and take this basting out. And then I'm going to bring that extra down that we created here. So that, so between this basting, I'm going to bring it down, which gives us a little pocket hiding our stitches. And so now with that pocket down and in place, I'm going to repin it here. And that allows me to sew it to just next to that vent there. And then the same thing on this side. So I'm going to take those basting out there, take that pin out and fold it down, which again takes that extra out of this area and allows me to refold it. So again, I want this fold to be exactly on, like right next to there. And then this piece gets folded at a diagonal. This one. So just like that. Okay. So I might have given myself just a little bit more here. So when I kept fiddling with this and pulling it down, I obviously pulled it down too much, but it's not going to be seen in the jacket. So I'm going to let it go this time. The other side was much better. I had the perfect amount, so I didn't fiddle with it too much. Okay. So then you're going to continue sewing the lining to the jacket vent. So I'm going to start on the undervent side, and I'm just sewing from here up, which is a little bit difficult because of the angle on this one, but I'll make it work. And then just hide your knot there. And again, you're just doing like a fell stitch. This is why I don't like sewing with pins, because I keep stabbing myself. Just tuck in your tips and it's less likely to stab you. So it's kind of like a whip stitch, fell stitch, slip stitch, whatever you like, whatever you think you want to do. It's not going to be seen from the outside, so it's okay if these stitches show. Okay, so instead of knotting it off here, I'm just going to do an extra little stitch. Like instead of knotting it and cutting it, I'm going to do an extra little stitch and then bring my needle up over here into that diagonal, which allows me to stitch across here. And again, I'm just going to do like a fell stitch here. And again, I'm just making sure this doesn't go through to the right side. Okay, so I just redistributed some of that ease down into the tuck so that I could make this a little prettier. So it's a little better than it did. Okay, and then you're just going to sew this right next to the vent. And again, making sure you're not going through to the jacket side. So feel that with your finger, that you're not catching. All right, and then you're going to knot this off. All right. And then with removing the rest of that basting, you'll be able to pull this lining down where it's supposed to be. For the most part, like you just want to make sure that when you're measuring that 1/4 inch and then shifting it up, that you're precise. So you could even thread trace it to help you out. Otherwise, you might end up getting a little extra lining that you didn't want. But I'm going to let it go because I like to show students what could go wrong. So you can see a difference between the two sides. So this one definitely is less pretty. Plus I'll probably take that out and demonstrate it again in class. So if you turn your sleeves right side out, you should not have any puckers or pulling of the lining on that sleeve hem. It should all just be smooth. You can take this basting out too. So, and then that will be ready for your buttons if you're putting buttons on. Okay, so that was the one we just did, and then this was the previous one. Okay. Okay, so the next step is to prepare our lining to be sewn to the hem of the jacket. So I like to lay my jacket flat on the table, making sure that it is smooth and flat, both on the jacket side and on the lining side. And then I'm going to pin that about 5 inches up from the hem, just so that it's stays smooth and flat just straight down this area. Okay, so we don't want it to be tight or pulling in any way. So if we take this to the other side, we shouldn't see that it is pulling in any way there, like when it's just nice and loose there. Okay, so once you make sure that that is nice and flat going this direction, you also want to smooth it out this direction. Now you do have extra fabric side to side as well as in length. So if you have too much of it, like so when you flatten out both sides, if you have too much, there is that tuck there in the middle that is there to make sure that you keep that ease. So you want it flat side to side, but you also want to make sure that you keep that tuck there. So I'm just going to pin. I'm not pinning through to the jacket. I'm just pinning the lining, that extra tuck into the lining, so that it's nice and flat side to side. So I'm just feeling underneath and everything's flat across the hem here. Okay. So in order to get this little like pocket that hides the hem, we need to make sure that we first we're going to pin it in place so it's nice and flat, and then we're going to fold it up so that we can create a little bit of extra fabric there. Okay, so I'm going to just take this and I'm going to fold this in so that it's just a 1/4 inch shorter than my jacket. And then I'm going to pin that in place about 3/4 of an inch up. 3/4, 5/8, about that. Okay, but I'm just going to do it at that 1/4 inch mark first, because it's a lot easier to just go across with a 1/4 and then adjust it after. So from here, it should be all flat and smooth, but then be a 1/4 inch shorter than your jacket. And again, I'm just pinning the lining, not the jacket at this time. So at this side, I sewed the lining right to the bottom of, to the, like where the bottom of the facing and the hem are. On the other side, I left a 1/2 inch gap. I prefer this way, but I'm going to show you both ways. So here on this side, I'm going to open that up and tuck that in. And hopefully that'll make it less unsightly there. Okay, so again, I'm going to flatten this all out. And because I've sewed it right to the bottom, I need to taper from that 1/4 inch down to nothing. So again, I'm just going to pin the lining only. Okay, so I still have this, so I can lift it up. And ideally, you want to have about 1 inch to 2 inches of extra lining down here, no more than that. So if you have too much, you can trim that off before you do this. So again, smooth and flat, and about 1/4 inch. Now on this side, where I left 1/2 inch unsewn, it's a little bit easier. I'm still going to leave a 1/4 inch at the very bottom. But you want to just make sure that when it's flat and smooth, that the whole thing is a 1/4 inch up from the edge, and then you're going to repin it so that it's about 3/4 of an inch on a full-size jacket. I'm going to do 5/8 of an inch here, and then I'll pin it down and baste it in place. You want to be consistent all the way across. So here, kind of tapers, but you still want to have it up a little bit. Okay. Again. Okay. All right, so now I've pinned that in place where I want it to be, and I'm going to baste it in place. Okay. So I'm not basting this right on the edge because I want to give myself some room to sew it. You're going to be sewing this with a slip stitch, a whip stitch, or a fell stitch, whatever you prefer. It won't show when that little flap is folded down. Okay, so this is the corner I sewed all the way to the corner, and I have a little bit of my seam allowance from the lining and the facing showing, so I'm just going to tuck that in with my needle so that it doesn't show when I go to sew this. You don't want it to be unsightly, so just make sure that you're just barely tucking it in. And then I'm going to hide my knot that I'm coming through on the lining only. I believe that's my basting thread, but okay. All right, so I'm just going to tuck that in, and then, like I said, I'm just going to do a stitch across here. I think I took, so I know that it seems like it would save you time to cut an excessively long piece of thread, but don't cut a piece longer than your arm, otherwise you're exercising and not sewing. So this should only be the length of one arm, and then you're going to fold that over so that it's not even that long. But don't double it. So you're not going to knot both ends. You're only going to knot one end. So this is, I believe, a fell stitch. A slip stitch is when you go in, and instead of coming up through both layers, you go in like on the jacket side, and then you go in on the lining side right in the fold. And so when it's sewn, it looks like it was machine sewn because it's also called the ladder stitch. So you're just going to go in through the lining, like right into that fold. So take a stitch in through the jacket only, like the hem of the jacket only. And these stitches are right across from each other. And when you pull it tight, they disappear. Okay, so unlike the fell stitch, they disappear. So I'm just going to do a couple more. So directly across from where you came out of the fabric, go into the fabric. And at first it looks like a fell stitch because you can see the stitches. But then when you pull it tight, the stitches disappear, unlike the fell stitch, which is more like a whip stitch in that you go in and out at the same time. So going in, coming out. So I'm going in the jacket, but I'm coming out of the jacket and the lining at the same time, while the slip stitch only goes in through the lining and out the lining and into the jacket and out of the jacket. So when I go to pull these tight, they don't disappear. You always see a little stitch there. So you can see the difference between the fell and the slip stitch and then the fell again. And then a whip stitch usually goes at a slight angle. So then you actually see a diagonal line of stitches on the edge. So any of these are acceptable to sew this shut. So there you go. So then a whip stitch is like that. Okay, so I'm going to knot this here. Okay, so you would just continue that across, and then you would remove your basting. Allow this to fold down, and then that covers your stitches. Now, it'll show a little bit on this corner, but you would iron that in place, and then that hides everything, and then this pin can be removed. On the other side where I left this little pocket, you will continue sewing across to that side, and then I'll show you what you can do when you get over there. Okay, so again, you have this little bit that is tucked in, and you just want to pull it up so it's just a little bit higher than that 1/4 inch, and sew it and keep sewing it across all the way to your edge there. Right to the corner. And then you're going to go down, closing up this little gap too. So when you sewed across the bottom of the facing in the jacket, you stopped 1/2 inch or 3/8 of an inch away from that edge. So you were able to tuck that in, but then you have an open little pocket here. So you want to sew that shut as well with your fell stitch or slip stitch right in the corner there. Again, just making sure it's not showing through on the other side. And then knot that in place. And then what's going to happen when you remove that basting there So again, this will tuck down and you just press that in place. And then, so I like this one. I don't know. You can decide which one you like better. So when they're both pressed, they both look good. This one you taper in, this one stays a little bit further away from the edge. So, and then it would again be pressed down like that. And so that is how you finish your hem with the couture / tailoring way. If you were doing this as a bagged lining, so like I mentioned, you would go from the inside and turn the whole thing, or have the whole garment inside out, the lining inside out, and you would sew across the facing and around, and then pivot and sew across the hem, leaving a hole either at the bottom here, in a seam, in the sleeve, just somewhere where you can turn it, and then you'd turn it right side out, press it, and then you would sew that shut. Okay, usually on machine, not usually by hand. And then we will be ready to go on to sewing on our buttons, and then that will be our finished jacket.